So if I could, since we are at the end of Genesis, I'd like the opportunity to challenge, or at least have you take another look at your position you've held with regards to Cain's reflection on the murder of Abel. I bring this up because it's actually a part of Genesis that has bothered me for a while, and it's not because it's not as straightforward as it's presented usually. I've been wrestling with it. So in this series, as well as in a couple of your Maps of Meaning lectures, you summarized it something to the effect of Cain coming to the conclusion that what he did leads to a punishment which is more than he believes he can face, which I believe to be born out of a natural reading of specific translation choices innocently made by editors just for readability's sake. So in Genesis 4:13, Cain does not say, "My punishment is greater than I can bear." He actually says, "Gadol aloni mitzo," my sin is greater than I can bear, which is to say, it's not his past actions. It's his future consequences, it's his past actions, not his future consequences, which he regrets. For him to say alon, iniquity or sin, that is too much for him to bear, is a reflection on the reality of his corruption and not a plea of mercy to the deity to spare him.
Okay, well that seems to be a deeper interpretation, I would say. And I think that's the same line of reasoning that Dostoevsky pursued in Crime and Punishment, right? Because in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov gets away with murder, and then he cannot stand it. He cannot stand that he did it because he's no longer the same person. But even more, he cannot stand that he got away with it. So that's more in keeping with that interpretation. So
this also is reflected in the following verse in 4:14, where he states the consequences of his actions, mainly that God's presence will be hidden from him and that he will be killed. The verse opens with the word hain, which means indeed, more or less, and denotes a sense of acceptance and not a complaint. It is the difference between saying, "Oh no, will God now hide his face from me and will I be hunted?" versus, "Of course God will hide his face from me and I will be hunted and killed." Which I've been wrestling with and have taken away to possibly mean that there are sins that we can do that will just push us too far.
Well, okay, so one of the things that you see in post-traumatic stress disorder situations, for example, is that people view themselves doing something so terrible, they don't know how to put it right. So you could say under those circumstances, the face of God is hidden from them because they cannot atone for it. They cannot reconcile themselves to it. It's there all the time, and they can't see anything good beyond it. It's hell, essentially. And so, sometimes when you're working with people with post-traumatic stress disorder, you kind of initiate them into a philosophy of good and evil so that they can see when Joseph talks to his brothers and they've got all this guilt, right? And he doesn't want them to have more guilt than necessary to fix themselves because it just burdens them otherwise. He says, look, don't forget, yeah, it was you, but it's also God's doing. And I had a client once who had obsessive compulsive disorder, and he was a very smart guy. He also happened to work in a radioactive lab that had a lot of radioactive materials, which wasn't the best place for someone with OCD. And he was worried that he would make some mistake, and this is very common with OCD, that would result in someone suffering, which you will, you'll do that. And it wasn't until I could get him to conceptualize himself and his life in part as a force of nature that he was able to reconcile himself to the possibility that an error on his part would produce catastrophic consequences. But people often find themselves in situations where they cannot reconcile themselves to what they've done. And that it makes sense to me that the interpretation that you're describing, that makes plenty of sense from a psychological perspective.
There are sins that will push us just beyond our limits that are too far. But there are also no consequences to our actions that are devoid of a truth we can accept and learn from. And this is what I've kind of delved out of this bit with Cain and Abel. So if this is the case, why then does it take us so long and with so much self-denial before we accept personal responsibility when faced with tragedy, especially when it's self-inflicted?
Well, I don't think you want to underestimate the contribution of just sheer difficulty. Like, let's say you're grieving because someone close to you died. It's like, well, it isn't just that you've lost, although that's a big part of it, it's that you have to rebuild yourself. And it's really hard to do that. So, and it is sort of proportional to the significance of your error. So if you commit an error and then you recognize that it's an error, if it's a sort of surface error, it's like, well, you can just touch up the paint. But sometimes the whole understructure is just rotten. And then you don't know what to do. And then, so that's one problem. It's just sheer bloody difficulty. And I see this with people very often. It's like they're at a point in their divorce, let's say, and they don't know what to do. They cannot solve the problem. It's too complicated. They just don't have the resources. And maybe they've squandered some of the resources as well, but sometimes they just don't have the resources. And then if you add to that error and sin and malevolence and blindness and all those other things, there's a guy named Thomas Saz who wrote this really interesting article in the 1960s, a book actually called The Myth of Mental Illness. And it was classic reading for clinical psychologists when I was training. And the reason for that is that Saz pointed out, and this is true, is that lots of times if you're a psychotherapist, people don't come to you because they have mental illnesses. They come to you because they have insoluble problems in their life. Like maybe they've had a 2-year affair at work, their wife is alcoholic, and and their father has Alzheimer's disease. It's like they just don't know what to do. It's too much. Now, they shouldn't have had the affair, so there's a moral issue. And maybe they should have intervened in the alcoholism in the family. Maybe they used their wife's alcoholism as an excuse to have the affair. Like these things get very tangled. It's so bloody complicated that people can't untangle it. So, and I would say that's in keeping with the interpretation that you laid forth with regards to Cain, it sounds like it's one of the reasons why it's so useful to read multiple translations, right? Because nuances matter. It sounds to me from that description that he actually woke up at least briefly and noticed what he did and said, there's no coming back from this. And you can easily get places that you do not know how to come back from. Now, they say, well, all things are possible with God, and there's always the possibility of redemption, no matter how serious the sin. But I'll tell you, sometimes people have no idea how to get back from where they went. Well, and you can understand often why people wouldn't do that, right? Yeah, well, that's a funny thing, because one of the things Carl Rogers said, too, about psychotherapy is that you can't do psychotherapy with someone who hasn't recognized that they have a problem. So it's a massive thing to recognize that you have a problem, and it does open the door, perhaps, to recovery. But it also means that you've recognized that you have a problem, and that can be very, very, it's the desert, right? You're out of the tyranny, but you're in the desert, and the sun's beating down on you, and there's no necessary reason to presume that you're going to survive. So,
thank you. Have a good night and stay well.
Thank you all.